Magic.me is the world's greatest school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. You can learn everything there, from chaos magic to hermeticism to meditation to how to supercharge your finances and take absolute control of your destiny. In short, you get all of the tools you need to turn chaos into beautiful, scintillating order and master your life. It's incredible. You've probably heard me talk about it on the show quite a lot. But check it out. It's growing fast. And I just want to say, if you're confused about where to start, because I have so many courses there, the Adept Initiative is the place to go. The Adept Initiative is the flagship course on magic.me, and it contains everything you need to know to master the most profound ancient techniques of changing your consciousness and the most modern and cutting-edge tools and systems for absolutely turning your life into a masterpiece. You're really going to dig it. Go check it out, and I will see you in class. It's magic.me, magick.me. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So why don't we just start off, as I usually do, if you just want to introduce your book and then talk a little bit about yourself.
My book is Earth AD, The Poisoning of the American Landscape and the Communities That Fought Back. It came out in 2020, so I haven't been talking about it so much. It's a book that's an oral history that profiles two environmental disasters, one in rural Oklahoma and one here in Brooklyn, New York. And so that was, I guess, going on 3 years ago now. So I'm in the middle of doing another oral history on, it's a way different thing. It's about the veterans of the movie industry where I work, just getting all those great old stories from, like The Exorcist and
Very
the
cool.
French Connection, all that stuff. I kind of grew up around a lot of these stories, and I love them.
Well, in terms of Earth AD, I mean, unfortunately, this is a topic that is never not timely, and one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is kind of in the wake of the East Palestine disaster. It's been something that has most certainly been on people's minds again, unfortunately. Also, in a sense, the war in Ukraine, combat around nuclear facilities, things like this. So I wanted to hopefully focus on Earth AD.
Yeah, happy to. I could talk about this horrible shit all the time.
Okay.
I think about it often, and not just say really climate change a lot, but environmental disasters are something that always interested me.
So Earth AD is a kind of, I don't want to say like roundup, but it's a look at ongoing environmental disasters. Or how to describe it.
It profiles two of them. I'm not an expert in all. I'm not an expert really in anything, but but I certainly spent a lot of time with the people who endured these two specific environmental disasters, and I profiled them because they were so different. One was in a red state, one was in a blue state, but they had a lot of similarities. Sort of like the way policy is approached from those two different political ways. And these were both legacy disasters, spills. One was mining. So anyway, the East Palestine thing, I followed that pretty closely because it's very similar. Like, when I read, I don't know, there was like 43,000. The EPA. I mean, you can't always believe what they say, but it was 43,000 dead animals.
Okay,
that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. So the two disasters that you profiled, I'm really interested in talking about those, not necessarily in terms of the details, but I think what you just touched on there with the difference in how those were handled in red and blue states, that's very interesting and kind of cuts to the heart of things. So these were Tar Creek and Newtown Creek in Brooklyn. So maybe if you want to mention what these disasters were, and real quick, just a little bit about your back. You're a documentary filmmaker, is that correct? And that's
I've done a lot of things like I've done that, and now I'm mostly into oral histories because they're documentary without all the bullshit fundraising.
Yeah.
I kind of hate all that part of it. And, I got some other documentaries I'm going to make. I just, and I have a few shot. I'm just doing this now, and each thing takes so long to do.
Yeah. It's kind of, podcasts are kind of oral histories in a sense, although usually published by people.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. In fact, it's kind of mostly what I listen to when I walk around and go to the subway and, and work. They're real documents of it. They're amazing that we have them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It gives people a forum to tell their stories, and people's stories are always so long, complex, convoluted, and non-linear and often nonsensical that you really cannot boil down the human experience, I think, into, a soundbite on the news or a 3-act movie, something like that. So
yeah, and the looseness, they're like free jazz in a way. You can kind of go off on a tangent, and the tangent could be very important to what you're talking about, even if it doesn't seem like it's important.
I think they capture real life. They capture how people actually communicate. So
yeah, very much so. It is documentary, it is, and it's journalism. I just was reading about a suit. I don't know the details of the suit, but like that people are going to now be kind of held accountable to things they say in podcasts of sort of effort at misinformation. What? I'll send you a link when we get off.
No.
There's
That's
a
horrible.
movement. There's a little bit of political movement about like misinformation, and that like, people, especially when at the level of like the Joe Rogan podcast, where people are talking about the vaccines and that sort of thing.
People trying to corral Joe Rogan because he's their new.
He might be their he might be their baddie. I don't know what, I don't really know the details, but I was thinking, how would you do that? It's like,
yeah, that's very well, like obviously slander and libel law covers everything. So I don't understand why there would need to be additional, and just this is a tangent. The idea of, as they were proposing, like a misinformation act, or like a department of ministry of misinformation, or whatever they were calling it, there is no universe in which that's okay. And the thing about podcasts that makes them so special is they're kind of the last frontier. Well, they're a new frontier, but they're also currently the last and perhaps only frontier of unfiltered speech. So radio's not, TV's not, the internet, social media is not, but podcasts are. And I think one of the reasons for that is that they're not indexable and searchable by Google. That may change with AI transcription, but YouTube is policed, but podcasts are not policed. There's no central platform on which they're distributed. So I guess people can be thrown off the Apple Store or whatever, or Spotify, but that's podcasts need to be left alone.
Yeah, I'm a very liberal guy, and I remember being a kid. I think we're about the same age. That, like, being a kid in the 80s, it was the right wingers that were into censorship, and then it's my side that's into censorship, and it's kind of fucked up, and I don't like it.
It's very fucked up. Do you remember, if we're about the same age, do you remember the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund in the Yeah, there was this really, really famous, high profile, famous, infamous perhaps, in the underground legal case, a guy named Mike Diana, who had a zine called Boiled.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I remember him.
Yeah, he lives in New York now. I saw him once in the East Village. But it was this, he was just this kid who did this totally deranged zine. And I think he got thrown in jail or something like that. It's like they really came down on him. And then there was this kind of pro bono legal concern thrown together called the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, that like all the big comic creators were supporting. And it was like all over, Wizard Magazine and all things like this. And it was kind of like seen as the cool thing to be into. And there was a really famous image that I think Frank Miller drew of somebody covering up somebody's, of a person having their eyes and mouth covered up with Band-Aids so they can't see or speak. And that was, it's like, that was kind of the Gen X ethos, what the hell? So
I think Bill Lustig or someone like that did a documentary about him. I haven't seen it, about Mike Diana.
That'd be interesting. It's like, and then all this stuff is forgotten now. Anyways,
that's one of those tangents we were talking about. So there's two environmental disasters, you know, there's so many to choose from. I remember when I was getting ready to do the book and I was like, what do I choose? Like, it's like, so you just start reading, and I was interviewing people who interested me in the environmental movement, you know, water rights people, and just all that stuff really got to me, you know, having kids too. And I was like, it's so crazy that we just don't really as a society, we don't value the environment like we should. And that seems very obvious, but it seems important stating. So I became very interested in these two different environmental disasters. The one in Oklahoma is called Tar Creek, and it was a mining town. There's a mining boom there. It was lead mining from like the 1900s till about the early 1900s till about the 60s. And then they just mined the shit out of it till there's nothing left. And so so the town was not only sinking, but there was lead everywhere. They put lead, obviously, like in the paint, but in the gravel, in the street, in the concrete. It was like this mine tailings. It was like the leftover rock from mining lead. And there's just piles of it. They were described as like moonscapes, like if you'd see it from an airplane. And there was years and years of battles, just like trying to figure out what are we going to do with all these people once they were recognized politically, but not having any real power. Sort of, they weren't prioritized by the government over there at the national. And they then eventually got on the EPA national priorities list and became one of the biggest Superfund sites in the world. There was a media frenzy and all this stuff. And then
just for those who may not know, what is a Superfund site?
It's a law. It was a law that was created in 1980 called CERCLA. CERCLA stands for Comprehensive Environmental Response and Liability Act. And it was a law passed in 1980 as a way for the EPA to deal with hardcore pollution sites. I don't remember what case kind of sparked it, but there's a list, and there's like, as of now, there's like, I don't know, something like 1,300 locations on it. And those qualify for national funding. So a certain amount of money is put aside for the EPA to either remediate, move people, do legislation, prosecute, all kinds of stuff. So this site was one of the earliest ones in the 80s to be named because it was like so outrageous. And then the other one is here in Brooklyn. I picked it because it was nearby. It's called Newtown Creek, and I lived in Greenpoint.
Is that Greenpoint?
Yeah.
Is that like, because I remember when I lived there, people were saying there was like an oil slick underneath Greenpoint or something like that. I remember.
Exactly. And there were oil tankers there. There were a lot of fires that led to these tankers leaking, but there was like, there was leaking. I forgot, but it was like more than the Exxon Valdez spill underneath Greenpoint. And this became very interesting to me because I lived there for, I don't know, like 15 years or something. There was all kinds of there was a lot of talk of it, but you didn't really like know, anyone don't really know where it was or anything. And then the gentrification hit, and then the activism really took on another life. In contrast to the people in Tar Creek, where they didn't have gentrification, they weren't around any kind of real power like that. So I became very interested in the sort of class warfare response in a way, you know.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, say more about that, like how this is how class plays into this.
Well, I mean, I was thinking about this in East Palestine. East Palestine has this you know, these trains moving through it, and these train tracks, I think they do move through some rich neighborhoods, but not really. They mostly move through poor neighborhoods. These places are drawn up in such a way, and you know, this probably has something to do with gerrymandering. I don't really know, but the way towns are drawn up, industry lives by poor people. I mean, there's this idea of you know, Dr. Ballard did this wonderful work on environmental racism. So Tar Creek, you know, in Oklahoma is a great example of this because that was on Native American land, and the Native Americans had sold their land to a lot of homesteaders and white miners, and but a lot of them still held on to it. And so there was a tribal sort of response. They were sort of ignored because they were on tribal land, you know, for a long time. despite pleas, you hear about it today with water rights in the native communities. And so there's a huge element of class, and that's why the activism,
it's also making me think of redlining and issues with lead paint and things like that, and kids growing up near freeways, and I do think that people like to people particularly on the right like to mock how overplayed perhaps racism is, and it's like, oh, everything's racist. But like, look, I mean, yeah, everything is racist. It's like,
yeah, they're
like environmental structural racism and redlining and things like that are pretty effing real and tangible and horrible.
That's right. And like, so there will be a sort of straw man argument with culture war bullshit, right? They use the sort of distracting sort of stories about identity politics or whatever, and that's very real stuff. And now they're doing it with trans rights, trying to distract bathrooms and stuff like that, just being bigots in that direction. But the racist element is very alive still, and you see it play out in the environmental sphere. And so when the gentrification moved into Greenpoint, to Brooklyn, and the same thing down in Gowanus Canal, which is also in Greenpoint, but I mean in Brooklyn, but it's more on the southern, it's more south. Newtown Creek divides Queens from Brooklyn at the northern end, so it's like a natural waterway. And I've been in a boat a couple times going up and down it. It's fascinating because and there's these river watchers who just keep an eye on things, make sure no one's dumping. There used to be like, and it wasn't just oil. There was Greenpoint also had it was like they had a dry cleaner that was leaking. They had a plastics factory that was leaking phthalates into the ground underneath a playground, and this went on for decades. And there was also another one that was like a dry cleaning. They call these brownfields. And they're all over the city. They're like these places that used to have heavy industry and have moved away, but their footprint is still there. So, you end up, one of the ways they figured out in Greenpoint what was happening, that there were these blocks where everyone got these rare brain cancers. And it was kind of like, eventually the people was like, they put it together. Like, we all live above this plume under the ground of dry cleaning. No, not that one. The phthalates, the leaking plastics. So that is very real. In closing, yes, the racist element and the class element is all there, and this thing in New Palestine is the same thing. These were all poor white people.
Yeah. And one thing that has struck me about the disasters you're talking about, and several other ones that I've read about or have personal experience with, is how little people know about, and how little people are allowed to know about, for instance, dumping grounds or the extent of environmental corruption. And we mentioned the culture war. I'm sure we're going to kind of go back to that as a reference point. And as a distraction. And of course, the focus is always on global warming. And of course, they're still having this ridiculous debate of whether global warming is real or not. But global warming is also a convenient, obviously it's real, but it's also a convenient focal point. When you really look at the environment, you realize you're like looking into like this, levels of Dantes Inferno of the things that have been done. I mean, just in America, because I really only know, I'm most familiar with America, although a lot of the rest of the world as well, but mostly America, how little the government has allowed people to know about not only what's done in their name, but the extent of what's around them, what they're breathing, what they're drinking. Flint, the water in Flint, Michigan is another example.
Yeah, and until something very theatrical happens for the media, in this case, it was like the controlled in Palestine, East Palestine, it was like controlled, what do they call it, the controlled release, the controlled burn, when they were like, okay, this thing might blow up, so we're gonna do what's called a controlled release of the chemical. So it was a sort of like, this ominous black cloud that was like that. People were just taking videos of their phones with, and they're like, why isn't this the story of the moment? Like, and I remember looking at like the front page of the Times on the homepage, and it wasn't like the lead story. It was like something about, I remember it was something about inflation reports.
Mm.
And it was like, I think it took this theatrical black cloud. Like if it was like a controlled release and maybe like you didn't see it, like it was just like one of an invisible gas, it wasn't like a burn. I don't know if it would have got the attention, because it took a while for that to get traction, even the way it looked. There was a visual component that was
People were very angry about that at the time, that it was, that was something visually dramatic, and yet it still was not getting covered.
Yeah, and like you said, we only really know about the stuff in the US because it's what we probably most access to. But there's that's just the thing, right? We don't know all of what's going on in the world. How could you? There's no possible way to know all the pollution sites going on. There's this wonderful book by what's that journalist Stephen Call. He did the book about ExxonMobil, and they pretty much operated like a nation state, moving into different countries, leaving these huge footprints, these huge disaster areas everywhere they went. They mine or whatever, pump oil out of the ground, and then just leave.
Yeah, it's disturbing to think about. One of the things about environmental corruption, I'm not sure I even like the word pollution anymore, because it just kind of like brings up cartoony images of smokestacks. It really does not suggest the extent of it. But the thing about environmental corruption is it's not dramatic. It's like, a slow burning radioactive isotope or something in the groundwater. It's like, by definition, it's the invisible killer.
Yes. And
so you're not going to get something to put on the news. You're going to get like slow building cancer rates over decades.
Exactly. And this happened in Tar Creek, where once the media caught wind of this like outrageous environmental disaster, and the media came in the 90s, and it became a hot story for a minute. And the people who lived there were telling me that the reporters came in for a few weeks, got their stories, and then they left, And meanwhile, this played out for generations. I mean, this was like a town that they were kind of ignored, but they had like a really good governor at one time who was a Republican, Frank Keating, and he really cared about it. He saw a story on the front page of their local paper, and he's like, how is this happening in our state? We have to do something. And he actually did, He was one of the guys who put it on the map, and he really took it to the people, and just like, we have to do something about this. And then that's when the ideas about moving all of these people out of their towns, and a lot of people don't want to give up their land, their homes. I mean, that's a very delicate thing to do. Yeah. When I went there was still like, I drove through there, and they were telling me you had to be careful. The other part of this is that the town was caving in. So there was this, not only like was the water like bright red from from metals, and this like lead poisoning, the town was actually caving in here and there because the mines were empty. And so if you have like ground, just like a town on empty land, and it was a bunch of little towns, that all had the same problem, but one was particularly caving in, and that's really scary shit. Like, that you could just be in the middle of the night, your whole house could just get swallowed up by the earth. Yeah, that was just the impetus to move them, right?
Yeah,
and that was, and of course, like I said before, the idea of class and race and all this stuff comes up often, because it just seems to be the same story over and over again. But this became very interesting to me.
That is interesting. Do you know about Santa Susana Field Lab?
No, what's that?
Okay, check this out. This utterly blew my mind. So in 2020, when COVID was going on, I was living in Los Angeles, and I was living in Glendale, which is like at that point was the epicenter of COVID. And we were trying to get out to, just like everyone else, I think everyone else in the US, trying to get out somewhere out of urban centers, or, maybe like find a larger place somewhere where, we could telecommute or work remotely. And that was very hard to do in Los Angeles. And then I ended up finding a house that was available for rent in Woodland Hills, or like West Hills, which is like way west of the valley. It's actually next to Spawn, the infamous Spawn Ranch, where
Oh, wow.
Charles Manson stuff went down. And I went out there, and there was like this beautiful house next to this beautiful park, and in this beautiful suburban neighborhood, quiet, lots of, it was practically the desert, rock, coyotes walking around. I'm like, this is perfect. This is wonderful. And so I was in progress of signing paperwork to rent this house. And then the night before moving in, I just looked up the neighborhood on Wikipedia, and it turns out that this house was right at the foothills of a river that runs from Santa Susana Field Lab. So Santa Susana Field Lab was a nuclear test site, they were working on nuclear reactors there in the 50s for the U.S. government. And it turns out that spot in West LA, it's right to the east of Thousand Oaks, is the worst nuclear spill site, or the worst nuclear disaster site in the world after Chernobyl. And nobody knows about it. And apparently what happened was there was a literal nuclear meltdown, and they had in the 50s, and they had to expose a melted down nuclear core, and just like East Palestine, vent it, and that vented out over the entire San Fernando Valley. And apparently the scientists or the technicians that were told to do this were venting it over their own families in many cases. But this was covered up for 20 years. And the exposed nuclear material is like still there, or at least was there until recently. I think that the government sold it to Boeing or something like that, and Boeing promised to clean it up, but they haven't. I think they're going to turn it into like a kids park, and it hasn't been cleaned up. And all this runoff was going down from there into West Hills. It was going out down into Thousand Oaks. So then I started looking that up, and lo and behold, over the last 50 years, there have been stratospheric numbers of like rare ocular cancers and things like that. And people under 7 years old, all the people that grew up there. I've since talked to people who've been affected by that. And no one was allowed to know about it. And this is in Los Angeles. I mean, it's like a Chernobyl level meltdown in Los Angeles.
That's amazing.
Like, no one knows about it. And there's like one NPR report from 10 years ago. It's like, yeah.
That's fucking crazy. Like,
horrible.
Yeah, that speaks to your point about how little we know about it. Like, I was pretty in the weeds on this stuff for a few years, and I may have like just found this one in passing and didn't stick, or I never heard of it because
no, it's not. I mean, I grew up in Southern California. I grew up in Southern California, and neither I nor anyone I know or have ever talked to, other than a few people who actually lived in the area and were affected by it, have ever heard about this.
What do you think? What do you think makes that so successful as a cover up? Right? Like, I mean, I can think a little conspiratorially about it. Obviously, it's not something that that people involved in it would want to talk about. But why didn't it become a bigger deal? And that is always interesting, or not interesting. That kind of trivializes a little bit, but it's something I think about a lot. Like, how come these things are not a bigger deal than they are? Is it like too big to deal with? Like do people just shut down after a certain point? Like climate change, right? It's like,
yeah, climate change is definitely, that's the case. It's just people are like, what do I do? And then they just shut down. It's too much. I mean, what literally
it's too big.
Yeah. So I think in this case, a big part of it was that it happened in the 50s, and nobody really cared in the 50s or had a sense of how big of a deal that was. I mean, this only got started. The only reason people started to become aware of this was it was after Silent Spring was published by Rachel Gross, began to draw attention to this. It's just not something people. It's like smoking or something like that. It's not something that people's attention was on at that time. And then in this case, they were told not to talk about it for 20 years, and so there was paperwork. If I'm remembering correctly. But I think that it's part of it is just like the passage of time. People forget, or they never heard in the first place. And it's just kind of like nobody cares to look. Another thing is like, who benefits from looking? It's like, it's like there's too much money in, obviously all those real estate developers in that area. Like, for instance, I had to get out of that lease, and the real estate company that was, leasing it to me, was denying the whole thing. They were saying, oh, there's no problem. I live here. My kids drink the water. There's no problem. and I had to really fight them on it to get out of the lease. So I think, there's a lot of financial, I don't necessarily want to say financial incentive, but there's no financial incentive to making people aware of it. I think that's the case a lot of times. It's just like, it's just a money thing.
Yeah, yeah, and that's sort of the role of investigative journalism. But like, yeah, I guess that's probably it. The funny thing about that is like the fiction at the time had like this sort of fundamental outsized misunderstanding of nuclear and the sort of like post-World War, the fear of like the atomic age, right? Like there's all these like really great B movies with like, attributing things to nuclear meltdowns that couldn't possibly happen.
Yeah, that's funny.
Like mutating.
Yeah, that's true.
And so like that's sort of, I'm surprised that sort of, that sort of fear of the unknown didn't like become even more outsized somewhere like that. I don't understand, like I think about this a lot. Like even here, there's more oil under the ground. It's being cleaned up, but like, most people here in the city, they don't know about it. That everywhere we are was a site of industry, unless it's just not. But a lot of the city is built on it. And the strange sort of thing about all this stuff that came up a lot is that all of these energy extractions and all of this mess came from people actually living a better life. They were able to have money, like you think with the miners in Tar Creek, that like they were able to like have a house and a middle class, and it was sort of like the capitalist dream. Extract a lot of energy resources, you pollute all you want, and we'll all make money.
Well, I think that's a big part of it too, and that's a big part of it now. And it's just like, I think that there's a really powerful thing where people are saying like, yeah, like I don't want to be doing this. This is bad, but like my family has to eat. It's like if I get laid off, my kids are not going to be able to eat. And I think that's a powerful thing that holds people in place. People who work for, less than ethical, scientific or corporate concerns now, or, they're working for polluting companies or things like that. I think human beings are very good at compartmentalizing things or weighing things and saying like, some version of, yeah, this is bad and I'm doing it, but if I don't do it, someone else will. And if I don't do it, my family's not going to eat. So
yeah, and my hands are not clean either. I mean, I work on a TV show that's on NBC, and who knows what the fuck they're into. They used to be GE, and so I mean, I've completely compartmentalized it, but I'm completely aware of the sort of hypocrisy in that, and I work on a show that maybe might not be good for society, but I mean, I'm just like in a labor union. I have certain protections. And I mostly just spatter blood on walls and stuff, and it's like fun. I make like a ransom note, or it's like the work I do. So it's like, I do look the other way too. I think we all have to, we all have to be a little hypocritical to live in the society that we're in.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, anyone who thinks that they're pure is feeling, unless they're living in the woods and they're Ted Kaczynski or something like that. It's like, I think you're probably fooling yourself. And, that's kind of the tricky trade-off with this thing. I mean, in the 2000s, I worked in advertising, but specifically doing green programs, internal communication programs for companies and environmental messaging, or as we now know it, greenwashing. So I worked doing greenwashing, and I was very, very well aware of the ethical compromises with that. But to my mind, the equation made sense, because it's like, well, what's happening here is a new standard is being set. And even if it's not perfectly followed at first, it's like society is having this conversation, corporations are having this conversation, and at least we're moving the needle towards where we want to go. And at the end of the day, it's up to the corporations to, almost all the pollution is and environmental degradation is from corporations. So it's up to them to clean up their own act. And, that's going to be a messy process always. I mean, just the way that corporations work, departments are always getting, started and then downsized. And if a VP comes in, a VP goes out, something falls in and out of fashion. So corporations are not monolithic entities. They're cultures as well. So, but I think that just understanding that, like, nobody, not only are there not sides, it like the very nature of the environment is we're all in it. So we all have a stake in it, and none of us, we're all corrupted. It's the nature of corruption.
Yeah, and then, that's all absolutely right, and I think so. And there's a sort of us versus them mentality that seems to pervade the environmental movement. That this sort of perfect solution is there somewhere, and we just have to keep fighting for it. And while that is mostly true, there are people. I've met a lot of these people too in TV who are actually concerned and trying to do something, trying to change the way this is. Like I serve on my union sustainability committee as a member, and this is the criticism we always hear from like the other members who don't do anything. They're like, well, what are you doing over there? We're, doing all these things and we don't know if they're working or what, but we're trying really hard to figure this out and how to make our business less wasteful, because it's wildly wasteful. At the end of the day, you could see a dumpster full of like wood from sets, paint, plastic bottles, just everything, right? And that's the sort of criticism I hear, and I'm just like, fuck off. Like, you're not really doing anything. We're like banging our heads against the wall trying to figure this thing out. Yes, we are like working with consultants. We are trying to work with the corporations to try to get them to change, but there's a real politic at play. Yeah. And it's not pure. It's very imperfect, and it will continue to be.
I think that's a very important. I think that's a very important part of just having an adult understanding of the world, and certainly an important part of trying to get anything done. I mean, like, if you talk to any politician, they'll tell you like politics is consensus building, and the nature of consensus is compromise on all sides. So it really, although like, look, I guess somebody has to hold out the absolutist extremist position on everything, because otherwise you don't have you don't have a reference point. So somebody's got to hold the reference point of what the ideal is. But in terms of actually conducting change towards that reference point, there's always got to be compromise.
Yeah. And the radical position, like you said, is super important to everything. I mean, even in the arts, like, I like a lot of very unlistenable music at times, because I've always been very interested in the line, lifestyles. It's all that is always going to be interesting to me. Whoever is pushing something furthest, it's a position that is always going to be needed. Yeah. Even if you're not going to occupy it, like you said, it can be appreciated and can be critical, especially when you get to social issues like this. Then there's the people. I guess what I was addressing was the people who don't do anything and they just talk a bunch of shit online, or that's less interesting, and I think that's less helpful and very juvenile.
Yeah, it is. One thing that I wanted to go back to is, in along those lines, and also along the lines of kind of what you've been mentioning about class. Actually, one second. Speaking of environmental degradation, my dog has gotten all the cleaning scrubs out from under the sink and is trying to eat them.
Go ahead, go handle it. I got time.
All right, total chaos. There's the official rule now is he interrupts every podcast at least once.
I've heard some of them where like the environment encroaches in a little bit, and I like that.
Oh, okay.
It's a little cinema verite. You were saying we were talking about the class issue.
Yeah. So kind of in regards to what you were just saying, and the class issue and some of the stuff we mentioned earlier, I am very interested in how these types of things are handled in red versus blue states, and if there's a difference, or maybe less of a difference than people might think.
I think it's the latter. I think that it's really it's less about the blue and the red than at the beginning. I thought the obvious find would be that they're ignored in red states and worked on in blue states. Well, it is true to some degree, like everything else, that there's degrees of it. It really depends a lot on the sort of activism community. And that's something that I didn't expect to find, that activism works in the long term. it doesn't pay dividends up front. It really like it's thankless, grueling sort of backstage work that isn't really seen until it is. And it usually ends with some, like when it does work, it ends with someone committing to remediate the land. Like in the case of Tar Creek, it was like a very, red state. These are people who didn't really have anything, and then the EPA hired a contractor to come in and remove the dirt. Okay, so they start to remove the lead from the dirt, right? This is just one of their fixes, right? One of the solutions periods of where they were going through that they were going to do this. And the contractor they hired was taking dirty dirt, moving it somewhere else, then replacing it with like dirty, lead dirt from somewhere else. Really cynical shit, like really nasty, right? Like, and I think it has less to do, I guess like my point is less to do with politics, like the political realm at the national level and more at the local level. And whether or not the financial stakeholders are still around. In some cases, you have pollution that can't be addressed because the company went bust 20 years ago.
Yeah, that I think is what went down with the Santa Susana Fuel Laboratory, where just like kind of hot potato had been played. Mm-hmm. Now it's like, who do you hold accountable? There was actually that same year, there was a thing that came out where a company, there was a news story that happened in 2020 in the middle of all the craziness, that it turned out that I think this was the final straw on why I left LA. There was a company in the 50s or the 60s, I think it was the 60s, that was just dropping barrels of DDT off the coast of Catalina Island, which is to the west of, it's just off the coast of Los Angeles. And that there were something like, I don't know, like hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of just barrels of DDT sitting on the ocean floor, slowly corroding and leaking. And all that DDT was like just nonstop hitting the beach of Santa Barbara and also, South Los Angeles, actually where Trump's golf course is in South Los Angeles. And it's just like the environmental toll, let alone like the carcinogens, the death of, I think there was like no sea life. They just sent it was UC Santa Barbara had sent a submarine down there just on like a research thing. And they're like, wait, what the hell are all these the barrels of DDT doing down here? And then they traced, they looked at, I guess they figured out where it came from. And it was from this company in the 60s that went out, it's no longer in business. So it's like, well, who do it was just some company out of, the Valley in Los Angeles. It's like, okay, well, like, who do you hold accountable? Like, presumably the state of California should be paying to clean that up. But,
and that's one of those things. Yes, exactly. All that 100%. And I've seen this play out, in this story and a few others where there's no one to sue. And that's a real, I wouldn't say I'm like a socialist or anything like that. I don't really understand enough about it to have like a real hardcore position, but I would say that this is a sort of a real obvious failing of capitalism. That obviously, if there's no one to sue, that this whole thing isn't going to be paid for, right? And somehow has to be paid for. Well, like the whole concept of money in this case seems ridiculous. Right?
Yeah, it's like the free market's going to fix that. It's like,
right? Like,
yeah. I mean, in theory, that's where the role of government should be, to step in and curtail the abuses of the market.
Yeah, and instead of just like we spend all our money on theater, like on prosecuting Trump, and then he just goes home to Mar-a-Lago at the end of the day and nothing ever really happens. It's just like theater. It's bullshit. Like when this stuff is actually happening to communities, and they might not have the activist community in place. They might not, and who can even fight that? It's just so big.
Who do you fight?
Yeah, like you have to fight who? The government to try to get them to help.
Right. I mean, I guess like in a perfect world, that would be like that could be a hobby horse for somebody seeking public office, or, it's like people who are in public office should be in the protective role of, in theory, I guess activists should bring that to their attention and they should act on it. And that's generally what happens sometimes. It's just that there's so many checks on, or there's so many barriers to change actually happening.
Yeah,
and people to get.
and you're right. It is a hobby horse for some people to make their way through the political spectrum, but then and because the human nature, they always end up being imperfect, and the solution's always imperfect, right? So like, you see this for like people in the activist community becoming politicians because it seems like it's the only real way to change, and that's depressing. That you have to include.
Why is it depressing?
Well, it's depressing that you have to go through this slow process that isn't geared towards doing anything. So it's already inherently rigged to moving slow and not responding to these things in the time that you know what I mean. Like they just go on and on and on from lawsuit to lawsuit. To petitioning and all this stuff. And meanwhile, you could just be poisoned by your drinking water and don't even know it because you're not in the loop.
Yeah. And then if you take it further, like what is the half-life of DDT? It's like, what is the half-life of a nuclear spill? It's like, in that regard, like no matter how slow the political process is, it's at the blink of an eye. But yeah, it's not cleaning up, not preventing something from happening in the first place is too slow.
Well, this is that thing we were talking about earlier, where like the cancer clusters don't come till 10, 20 years later.
Right.
My great aunt lived in Merrick, Long Island, and her husband, and I didn't know there was a spill there, when I was a kid. And they, her and her husband both had this sort of rare lymphoma, and that's shocking to me. That could happen. Still shocking, even though like I've known about it for so long.
It is shocking, and you can bring pharmaceutical companies into it as well. During the whole COVID thing. It's like you look up some of these companies and it's like, what was it? Johnson and Johnson was selling this baby powder, talcum powder that caused, ovarian cancer and like tens of thousands.
Yeah.
And then they got busted for it. So what did? They just turned around and started selling it in the third world. And it's like, these are the companies we're trusting. It's like, what was it? Pfizer was like experimenting on children in Africa without any type of consent or anything like that, and just doing these awful experiments. It's like, we're not talking about it's like part of me wants to say it's like, oh well, it's just the systems, it's just like the nature of capital, but like it gets to a point where it's like, man, you almost want to believe that there are just like these like demon possessed monster people like behind the scenes running these things, because it just gets so dark.
Yeah, and in your mind, you need to have something to push against, right? It's like this. You kind of can understand conspiratorial thinking in that way, like, because the evil is so outsized.
Yeah.
At times, especially when you involve children and pregnant women.
Yeah. And my line on, conspiracy, as you might imagine, conspiracy theory stuff comes up a lot on this show. Like my line on conspiracy theories is always like, forget conspiracy theories, look at conspiracy fact. And I get so frustrated when people start going off on these like QAnon pizza, like David Icke tangents, where it's like, all you need to, like, that is such a distraction and cop out. All you need to do is just get on Wikipedia and look at what these companies have actually done. And there's more than enough. I promise you, there is more than enough cosmic horror in the truth. You don't need to go hog wild making stuff up. All you need, and none of this is hard to find. Go on Wikipedia, go to the public library, and all of these crimes are right out in the open for you to see. And it's people ignore them because it's too, even during the during the whole vaccination drive, people had to willfully ignore this stuff.
Yeah, and we all got these shots. We're not getting sick from COVID now, and a lot of it has to do with, these drug companies. Like they're often made out to be these evil people, but they developed that vaccine in a year, and that was a record time. And people are so terrified of it. But they're politically engaged to be terrified with it.
Right.
That's what's so weird. It's like like you said, there's so many. So again, these are very imperfect things. These are complicated, layered problems that there's no easy way to talk about them. Like it's the pharmaceuticals have issues. we're all, we could talk about Exxon all day, but we all still like rely on the trucking industry.
And it's like, that's the thing. I mean, I look at this stuff and it's something like you also can't divorce yourself from this. It's like, yeah, these monstrous acts are being done, but they're being done in your name. And unless you want to become, Ted Kaczynski or something like that, or just drop out and live in the woods, you're benefiting from these systems. You're benefiting, if you're American, you benefit from the crimes of the American empire. That's just how it is. And so it's disingenuous to divorce yourself from that system. It's like, I'm sure the that Kurt Weill song where he says mankind is kept alive by bestial acts. or William Burroughs said the meaning of naked lunch is, naked lunch is when everyone sees what's on the other end of their fork in one frozen instant in time. And it's like, that's the thing that people have to realize. And they also have to understand is why things don't change. It's because like these systems are in place for them.
Yeah. And it's hard not to become a preacher, right? Like, to keep that's the thing that could temper you from being a hardcore preacher to being like, the sort of hypocriticism of all of it is really, like, I don't eat meat, but I don't fucking tell anyone else what to do because I don't know what's right for them, and I don't necessarily even, a lot of my friends probably don't even know that I don't eat meat. I don't really, like, I'm not a big foodie, so it doesn't really make a difference to me. And I think that, like, I don't want to be that guy, I don't want to be the guy who's, the warrior, there is value to being a warrior, and I just don't have it. I don't think, I listened to your podcast, The Angel Millar, who's a guy I know, and I know Angel, and, I love the idea of the poet warrior. And I think that's very beautiful and important, but it's very difficult for me because I'm too self-aware of the hypocriticism in my own self.
Right. Well, that's kind of like that classic line of, it's like good people are crippled by self-doubt, where evil people, they have no such compunction.
Right.
So there's kind of an element of that to it. But I've thought about this a lot because, the number one thing here is like journalism has collapsed. And so people are in the dark and they don't know what's happening. But when I was working a lot more in journalism, like my thinking was like, I was constantly like writing these stories. I was writing about environmental, like oil spills and things like that for Vice and environmental issues. And I kind of got to this point where I'm like, okay, well, I'm researching these things and I feel good and I feel like I've done a good thing, and they're going out into, they're getting a lot of traction because they're on Vice News, but it's like, well, what happens then? So I was like thinking about this, like, well, in theory, in a well-working society, journalists are supposed to surface the information, and then I suppose activists or politicians are supposed to pick it up and do something about it. But what's happening instead, because, well, first of all, the information's not coming out in the same way. Certainly, well, I would say information's coming out, but there's not things like year-long investigative reports on things. There's no budget for that. BuzzFeed shut down yesterday. They did a lot, despite BuzzFeed being annoying, they did a lot of good investigative journalism.
Yeah, they did. And they realized that the stupid stuff was keeping the lights on,
Yeah. That's always been that was the case in the 19th century with the press. But I would disagree that journalism has collapsed. I think there's excellent journalism being done all the time. I think we're just overburdened by there's so much of it. My wife works at the New Yorker, and I see her working on these pieces as a copy editor, and I listen in on these meetings, trying to figure out the right wording for this and that. And it's like it's like they're all trying to figure out the same thing, which is like how to keep the lights on, how to keep doing real journalism, but while still getting the ad revenue clicks. It's complicated like anything else, Very complicated. I mean, that's a very tough business. And then of course you can get into things like, well, there's private funding like The Intercept, but it's like, well, then how objective are you at that point? If some rich person is bankrolling, it's like, how different is that from the Washington Post with Jeff Bezos? So it's a tricky one.
That was the thing about the East Palestine, going back to that was like, who is reporting on it and who is not reporting on it, and who the stakeholders were in not reporting on it, kind of speaks loudly too.
So,
you know, how who is owning. I don't know the whole chain of command of who are the shareholders who own bits of the media, but also own the freight railroad companies, and there's a lot at stake for these people who own all these companies. You know, that this comes up often when you start getting really into this stuff. Who's not reporting on things?
Do you have other examples of that?
Well, I mean, all of these, all off the top of my head, all of these sites, you know, were affected by the journalism of their time. You know, in New York, you had the Hearst papers that didn't want to report on Standard Oil. I think I'm getting that right. It was the Hearst papers that didn't. I could be getting that a little wrong, but there was something like that. Like there was the people who owned Standard Oil had a stake in the Hearst papers. You know, when these first leaks happen. So it's a little dodgy on that. I'm not quite sure if I have a good example of that, but that's certainly something that you think about when you read this stuff.
Yeah, that's one of the things that
you'd have to research it all the time. I mean, you'd have to be on top of who owns what all the time. It's kind of like media outrage. Like when someone's getting canceled, it's like, I don't know who's getting canceled because I don't know everything everyone said. I don't really care, you know, but this is just one of those things that you can just live in that world.
Yeah, and living in that world is exhausting. I mean, I used to read 600 RSS feeds a day, trying to scour that for just needles of information. It's very hard to do, and you know the nature of the blogs and I don't know how it is now, but you know the nature of social media, blogs, and news outlets is everyone's hearing a rumor and then trading it up the ladder to higher and bigger outlets. So you end up with a lot of repeated information. But
yeah, and everyone's on Twitter getting the same sort of thing.
Yeah. And I forgot where I was going with that, but I remember what I was going to say. It's like, that's one of the reasons why, first, it's so unbelievably exhausting to be constantly trying to do that every single day. For somebody who does it for a living, let alone normal people are not going to do that because they got all kinds of other problems to do, issues. They got to take their kids to school. They got to care for their aging parents. They have to pay a mortgage. It's like they got real world problems.
Yeah, like living a full life, not just like living inside of like this information.
Yeah, which is not healthy. It's not healthy to be on Twitter all day long.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's also taken a lot of psychedelics, I kind of also see that.
You say also as if you assume I have.
I've listened to your show, and I find that like that sort of opened me up as a young person to like being interested in so many different things. That I guess I could inhabit that world fully, but I don't want to. Like that who is that artist who's really great? He used to draw these like bubbles, like these information webs, and they were like these huge drawings. They were like who owned what, who's connected to the Bush family. And
what is that? That's interesting.
I'll find it and send you a link. I forgot. Mark something. He kind of had a moment here, but in the end, he killed himself. And I don't know anything about his personal life, like maybe why he killed himself. But I can guess inhabiting that world all the time.
A lot.
What's that?
It's a lot. I found that it's like when I'm in that, I get pretty dark, and I think somebody on Twitter responded to one of my tweets, I think a couple of years ago, or was on Instagram. And I was actually really kind of moved by it in a way where they were saying it's like, it's like the way that you've been on social media. It's kind of like is what in Lord of the Rings, there's this character that's constantly scrying the efforts, or Saruman, I think, is constantly scrying the plans and efforts of the enemy all day long in his crystal ball until he becomes corrupted by it. And brought over to the dark side. And it's like, that's obviously, dramatic, but I think there's a certain truth to that, in the sense that if you meditate on something, you become it. And meditating on that level of corruption and malfeasance and it's like, it's never going to end because there's always more. And you can't tune it out. It's like I can't take it when people are just like, well, I don't read the news because it's all negative. And it's just like, well, that is just totally irresponsible. Although I do understand it with some people, because it's just like, it's like,
Yeah.
it is mostly negative. But I think that, like, in order to inhabit that space, you have to have some type of spiritual practice, at least some type of meditation practice, so that you can kind of like see the humor in it, at least, or at least to some extent have a sense of emptiness or insubstantialness about it, where it's like you can to some extent see it as illusion as well.
Oh, that's interesting. Like, so like, that's the sort of, that's the psychedelic training where I'm like, yeah, but I do see the cosmic joke that we're
exactly.
that we're all not going to be alive to watch it all play out. And it's like tragic, and it's so tragic. It's sad. Like when you have that laughing fit on psychedelics, because at some point you're like, oh, none of it really matters once you've let go and you sort of just like, think about it in the broad view. I love that. I love that. I think that's great. What
I think it's like none of it matters, but I mean, you should still do something, but you just can't, like, you can't take it on the chest so much that it kills you. You've got to have a bit of a light touch.
Yeah. And it's sort of like, I like what you said about inhabiting something so long that you meditate on it, that you become it. I think of like someone like, like those sort of like journalists who become right wing, even though they weren't. They start off as like lefty journalists investigating stuff, and they end up like inhabiting. I'm thinking of like a Glenn Greenwald, maybe, or like maybe someone like
deal with Glenn Greenwald, because I know that he is constantly kind of on Fox News, and he's become like a bête noire of people on the left. But like, he seems like somebody who's run by spite. But I'm not aware of where he's been at since Snowden, which was just heroic.
Yeah, I thought that exactly, that was amazing. That film, the work they did, amazing. But like,
because people also accuse Julian Assange. The people accuse Julian Assange of being like a right wing Trump stooge, and it's like, really. It's like, I don't understand that.
And the same thing, yeah. There's a lot of these sort of public figures. I guess like the left punches so much on them that they end up just becoming like embraced by the right wing, because they're getting beat up for not being perfect culture warriors.
Yeah, that's a major failing on the left. I mean, like I'll look at this from the flip side. I mean, it's like I used to be like so critical about the, as Trump says, Russia narrative. Everyone who doesn't agree with the DNC party line is a Russian operative. But like, there is some truth to that. I mean, there's just so obvious. There are obviously people who are bad actors and are just acting out of, either being paid by foreign state media or just spiteful. And I think that anyone who's a defector, whatever they're defecting from, too, is at risk for that.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And let me ask you something. I've been thinking about this since, I was listening to a lot of your podcasts a few weeks ago, and I was thinking about like asking you if activism is magic, because it seems like an area where this could overlap. Like it's like willing something into being so hard through like this sort of like it's like a working of several people,
Yeah, absolutely.
Doing like,
I mean, everything's magic, right? I mean, that's like the glib answer. It is true. But, with activism specifically, or, as Crowley put it, magic is causing change to occur in conformity with will. So with activism, and I think that, I'll put it this way, that's a kind of border that I've been on that's a point I've been trying to make my entire professional career, particularly in the 2000s. It's like I came of age during, as a writer, as a political thing, as somebody who's engaged in politics, and as a magician during the Iraq War. And my being is permanently shaped by that and being so angry at what happened that it was just like, okay, like there's got to be some way to counteract this. And that is kind of where, that's how when I met Jen, that's where I kind of ended up going down this rabbit hole of magic. And then my first book, Generation Hex, was very much about merging those two things together. And I think that I'll put it this way. I think that if and I've been making this point for a long time, I think that if activists saw what they did as magic and were much more focused, and I think just people on the left in general were much more focused and disciplined about what they were doing. For instance, picking one thing that they want to happen instead of 67 things in a list that all need to happen, that are all interconnected. Just that one change of focused will would do wonders.
You think so? I agree with this. I got very interested in Crowley, and not to the degree I wouldn't consider myself a magician or anything. This is clearly your territory in a way I'm not very knowledgeable about, but it's something I was interested in, liked. And I only read the one book on Crowley, Proto-Rabo, which I don't even know if it was I liked it, but I don't know if it was a good one or considered a good.
It's pretty good, yeah.
But I think that there's some truth to that. But are you suggesting that like the left could work in like together by saying, look, I'm gonna work towards this one thing. If there's 67 things to do, you're gonna work on climate, and I'm gonna work on race, and you work, and down the line we in the capacity of magic.
Yeah, I think that one thing that you learn, magic is just like electrical engineering or physics or something like that. What I mean by that is magic shows you that, the fastest point between two things is always a straight line, or to use another metaphor, if you're trying to do something in your life, you have limited time. We all have very, and I become much more aware of this as I get older. We have very, very, very limited power, time, energy. Energy goes down as you get older. Other responsibilities go up, and we all have very, very limited time, energy, and so forth. It's like people look at fictional magic, and it's all wizards throwing fireballs around and things like that. And it's like, well, in a sense, that's what it is. It's just that the energy you're using is not some mystical energy. It's just like your normal life energy. And if you look at anyone who's been successful at literally anything, at literally any time in history, they have just drilled down on that one thing until they've been successful at it, and not, splintered off their efforts into 17 different directions. A classic example would be, I don't know, Thomas. Well, this may be apocryphal. Let's not get into specific examples, but we can all think of people who have been very successful who just they monomaniacally pursue one thing for maybe decades, without any expectation that it's ever going to pay off. And then that's what it takes to make a dent in anything. And so, it's like, I don't, what do I describe myself as left now? I mean, I feel very alienated from where, what people call the left now. I still have, the same political beliefs I did in my 20s. It's just that I feel very alienated from the political landscape currently. But I mean, the thing that I think of, it's like I was at Occupy LA in 2012, and it was like, this is amazing. It's focused, it's clear, it's concise. And then the next thing, it's like they're having this meeting, and it's like, well, we need to get like a manifesto together. And it's like literally like 67 things are on it. Or when I went to the protests of the Republican National Convention in 2004, or the protests against the Iraq War in London in 2004, which were the biggest protests in history at that time. You see like people tacking on or the 1999 WTO protests. It's like you see people tacking on every possible conceivable issue to it. It's like, no, just focus on the one, pick one thing that is achievable and drill on it until you achieve it. And I don't think you need to call that magic. I mean, magic is just largely a metaphor for thinking about how you use your limited time on this planet. I mean, it's like if you're trying to punch through cardboard, push one nail through. Don't push 67 nails through, because then you're never going to get through the cardboard with 67 nails.
But magic has a connotation with phenomenology. Like, yes, I understand it as you do, is like electrical engineering, right? Like, it's just, But there's an element to it that I don't fully understand, but I think I believe it because I've seen it play out in synchronicities and things that happen in a person's life that lead you to believe that something is happening here. And I don't understand it, but it's very real. Like something in a room, like a vibe, right? Like you just, you ever go in a room and it's like a sinister vibe, or like, that it is electric on some level. It is energy, but I don't know, enough about it, that there's a phenomena at play that we as humans probably just don't understand.
Yeah, all of that is absolutely real too. It's just when I tend to talk about magic and to a public audience, I try to, as much as possible, lean on the completely rational and pragmatic end of it.
Yeah, and I guess that's the point. That's the point of, like, I guess I was curious on your thoughts about activism. I think I was more interested in the sort of irrational view of it. Like the irrational point of being like I guess I was interested, and I think you did answer it, is that the take on all of these people working so hard and willing something to existence is like something just beyond just the hard work, just beyond the focus, that at some point something else happens. Like an energy shift or something. And I think that's very interesting, and I don't know a whole lot about it, but I think that's there.
Yeah, I think in this case, and this is what I would tell my students at Magic.me also, I don't think that it's in that case, or let me put it this way. What I kind of tell people is, if you're able to harness 100% of your being towards anything, you will, over extended period of time, be able to do things that other people, to all intents and purposes, look like magic to other people. And the reason is not that you've got some like supernatural power. It's that you're fully using your natural power. And this is not, I mean, it's similar to, but it's not like using 100% of your brain, because we now know that that's not a scientific thing.
Right.
It's kind of that growing up. Yeah, it's kind of the same idea though, where it's like you're harnessing everything that you do towards a goal. The majority of people, and now more than ever, are just like chaff in the wind. They're thrown about through a million electronic distractions every day, and they have no overriding purpose in life. They have no, and that's fine. I mean, most people exist largely to perpetuate and preserve this what is, and that's necessary. But and it's, as long as they're not actively destroying things, that's fine. But causing change requires more, and this is kind of the sense of people think about sacrifice in magic. It's like, yeah, you do have to sacrifice. Activists have to sacrifice quite a lot. Activists in a way sacrifice so many other things they could be doing in their life to pursue this goal that is probably not going to benefit them personally at all. So that's one example.
That's very beautiful. And that's very beautiful. It's a very beautiful way to live, like in the service of something bigger. I think it's rewarding in a way that isn't obvious. That when you talk to activists, some are driven by ego, but the majority of them seem to me to be, and this is just completely subjective from my experience, but they seem to be motivated by sort of religious, even religious, maybe it's not the right word, but a belief in what they're doing that's bigger than them. And that does seem to me to be what I understand to be magic.
I think so. And I think that element of, I feel like that's necessary in the case of activism, like that belief in some type of higher power. And that could just be like that there's justice in the universe. I mean, like, that's a very compelling belief right there. Or that even if there's not justice, that human beings can make justice possible. That's very compelling. And that's something bigger than the day-to-day, grind of and wear and tear of being an activist. But it doesn't have to, magic is just this thing, belief in something higher. Chris Hedges is a good example. He's a priest, right? But he's been an activist and a journalist for decades on this stuff. So I think that this is one of the most powerful, when it's done in this way, this is one of the most powerful things about religion, And it's traditionally, particularly in America, been one of the most powerful things about the progressive side of Christianity is, or in many ways, the Catholic Church throughout history, not all, obviously, but in some ways, it's like this belief in a higher power allows people to do things or to push back against the terrestrial authorities or power structures in a way that is much more potent and sustainable.
I've become interested in the idea. I use the word interested a lot. I guess I have a lot of interest, but I've become interested in the idea of the role violence plays. I think of the civil rights struggle and the Black Panthers or the eco-terrorists. The fact that the 20th century where activism really worked, there was an extreme position that we were talking about earlier, the sort of extreme position. I think that book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and this sort of radical element of it, and how that plays into the broader strategy of activism. And sometimes I do feel angry enough, if I can get myself worked up enough, to fully embrace it.
Well, as this is a public podcast, I do not in any way condone violence. But I will say that, it's like, look, if you look at the history of the world is violent struggle. But I'll also respond to this specific point with a counterpoint, which is the history of activist movements getting crushed in America has also been the police or federal law enforcement inciting violence so that they can be crushed.
Yeah, but in some cases, their violence was the only alternative left.
What's an example?
Well, I think the civil rights got incredibly violent. I mean, yes, Dr. King was incredibly persuasive to people, but Malcolm X had to take the other position, and it's still going on. There's still violence. There's early Malcolm X before,
Yeah. I think that I'll put it this way: as a student of history, I'm not sure I even consider myself an activist right now. I mean, I just do my thing.
Yeah, me too. But it's an area that this germane to this conversation about pollution.
I think that as a student of history, I obviously do not condone violence. I make no prescriptions. I really don't. But my mind is just not geared to be that engaged in events, to even be kind of in that thought process of thinking through things like that. But I think that looking at things from a broader perspective and as a student of history, I think the liberal position of violence is always wrong is just demonstrably false looking at history. I mean, history often turns on violence, but I will say it's usually it turns for the worse. And
revolution. Because the state is always going to be stronger. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The state is always going to be stronger and will counterattack. And if you're successful in dissolving the state, then you're really fucked because it's like I've talked a lot on this podcast about there's a book called Bloodlands, which is a history of the unbelievable violence in Eastern Europe in the World War II period between the Soviet Union and Germany. And it's like, I've watched so much of this guy's stuff and he's kind of involved in the historical overview of the Ukraine conflict as well, Timothy Snyder. And he makes this point where this was kind of in response to Trump in January 6th, where he was like, look, it's like the point at which the killing begins, where genocide begins, is when the state fails, or the state, if the state is successfully overthrown, that's when the mass killing begins. And that's just true throughout history. It was true in the French Revolution. It's like, so I'm not so hasty on things like that. And I do think that, we've seen things in the last few years where people are committing terrorist acts or lighting themselves on fire, in Washington, D.C. And it's kind of like, well, what does that really accomplish? I'm not sure.
Right. That's the area that's interesting, right? Because if you look at Yeah, yeah. Like if you look at, like, oftentimes when there's like an attempt on the government, like you look at January 6th, there's usually the task of getting that far is so daunting that there's no plan.
Not a particularly compelling attempt, but yeah.
Right, right. This is kind of a straw man argument here, but the fact that there's no plan in place after, right? You got in there. Now what? Did you take over? I mean, like it's like oftentimes the violence doesn't come with an end game that's really thought out.
Sometimes it does. I mean, like the Russian Revolution, they killed the Tsar and they instituted, they had a plan, which was to institute communism. And, within a few decades, it was just purging people who were considered to be in opposition to that system. So if you look at any of these big events and you set the politics aside and just analyze them from the perspective of just pure human suffering, it always gets worse. Outside of maybe like Václav Havel, like the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia or something like that. Like, I can't think of or maybe like the Orange Revolution in like the Netherlands, like many hundreds of years ago. It's like, I can't really think of any examples of nonviolent state change.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds right to me. And the way the global order was before the sort of global connectivity is that's really context dependent.
Yeah.
You'd have to fight a lot of it online, and it's just a different global order now. I don't know.
I want to make a caveat to that. I just realized, which is just like, all of that aside, I mean, just like from a historical perspective and a position of logical accuracy, when it's like super liberal people get like really whiny and say that like violence is never the solution, it's like, well, what they're really saying there is, I quite like the way that the state uses violence on my behalf right now. I would like that violence to continue.
Yeah.
It's like, even if you think about like arguments about like, it's like, what is gun control, or even taxation? I don't want to go to like super libertarian here, but it's like, even to make strong arguments on behalf of gun control, or let's just say gun control or higher taxation. It's like, what are you saying? You're saying that men with guns should go to, I want men with guns on my behalf. I don't want to get my hands dirty, but I want men with high powered guns to go to your house on my behalf and take your things or kill you. Right. It's like, how is this a nonviolent position?
Right. It's again, this is like not thought out. I think that there's an idea that, it's like when we were talking about Superfund sites, and that, the idea we're going to go to the government and this needs fixing. So that's the role of government, right? That this is like beyond our capacity to deal with it ourselves. It's the government's role is to keep us safe. Okay. But then there seems to be a very selective, at least in the sort of liberal sort of online left I've seen. I'm not incredibly online, so I don't know, but it seems to be a sort of selective use of violence regarding.
What do you mean specifically?
I guess I'm thinking about property and policing, and everyone's super real lefty until it's their own shit. That's until it's their own stuff, right? Like, I'm thinking of like stuff like defund the police, and like, I just don't think it's very well thought out for the most part.
No, it's not. I mean, like in California, it was like, okay, it's like, we want to, it's like at one time, I don't want to go too down this rabbit hole, but it's like, it's just infuriating. It glitches my brain out, where it's like in California in 2020, the two arguments happening at the same time. By the way, in the middle of an effing zombie apocalypse. On one side, it's, okay, there should be 100% gun control. No one should have guns but the police. And on the other side, it's, we should defund the police. It's like, okay, so where does that leave us? It's like there's no recourse to self-defense or even self-protection or protection, period. And I know that I'm oversimplifying some of these issues, but it's just, it's not well thought out. I think a broader point to make here, whether it's America or the rest of the world or just history in general, is that the nature of existence is violence. Everything is violence. And the only reason that we don't think things are violence is because, I don't know everyone who listens to this podcast, but I think, at least you and I mean, the only reason why we don't think of things as constant violence is the fact that we live in a wealthy enough society that is, our violence is outsourced to other people and we can pretend our hands are clean. But the nature of the nature of reality is the nature of reality. Yeah, the nature of reality, the nature of human society is violence, and that's just how it is. And is the state violent? Yeah, it's like, does the state use violence in ways that are abusive? Yeah, and that's a bad situation. However, the state no longer having a monopoly on violence, which is kind of the role of the state, is way worse. It's like, if you think this, the things that the violence the state metes out is bad, and it is bad, wait till you see the alternative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we all have to deal with our own violence in a very personal way. I don't know if you've done any martial arts or anything like that. I walk around the city with, like, there's the threat of violence whenever you have this many people is always going to be lurking. My mom's from the Bronx. She always carried a knife. She's like 70 years old, still carries a knife around Florida. It's just like what I mean, what you see enough shit, you start to internalize some of that violence. I feel it myself.
Yeah, and same. I mean, I've done years of self-defense training in various ways, and I felt I had to when I lived in Los Angeles and when I lived in New York, and I've been the victim of violence a few times. So I think that, it's still nothing compared to, like, living in Ukraine or something like that. I mean,
sure, this is all relative.
Yeah, but life is conflict, life is struggle, and that's just how it is. And I think that this is why I find people who present themselves as nonviolent a little bit disingenuous, because, let me just put it this way, unless you're willing to go through the entire supply chain that brings you everything that you own and remove anything that relies on human slavery and coercion, which is, by the way, everything we're currently using to record this podcast, let alone oil, let alone, so much of our stuff has slavery in its supply chain. It's like, I don't want to hear about being nonviolent.
Yeah. I thought about this. I remember thinking about this watching Occupy. I remember thinking, like, people they're using these products of venture capitalism. There was when the iPhone first started to come in. It was when we first started really seeing a lot of iPhones, and people were making videos and stuff. And I was thinking, like, you could police the corruption in these corporations, what they're trying to do. There's a sentiment behind a lot of the activism I like, that you have to sort of discard some of the hypocrisy and some of the posturing and bullshit that comes with it. And that's something that's just a fact of life.
You just can't act holier than thou.
What's that?
You mean in a sense that you should just not act holier than thou?
Yeah, that was what I was getting at before about being a preacher, about, like, not being very careful to not be a preacher. It's a little hard when you know things, but you realize when you know things, you actually don't know a whole lot. I think there's the Aristotelian position.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just the more you know, the less you really know. The more you learn, you don't know.
Yeah, I agree. And certainly just the more I pay attention to and study reality and the way that it's put together, and the way that society is just this intricately, society is not chaos. Society is this intricately constructed, beautiful, like, multi-level puzzle that has been constructed by thousands of years of layered on human effort. And everything in society functions for a reason and interlocks with everything else, even things that don't make sense to us necessarily on the surface. So, but that said, I mean, it's like it's like, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't try to change it, because activism, social change, even, violently, perhaps, well, I want to watch my words here, but, like, challenging the system is part of the system.
Yeah.
Part of any system. It's like, that's how the system moves forward, but you're not coming at it from outside of the system. It's like the system needs some roughage in it to keep it on point. And if you just look at the last 20 years, look at how much positive change has happened. If you look at the last 200 years, look at how much positive change has happened. Even in our lifetimes, like the conversations that are being had about race, for instance, it's like tremendously positive change has happened. And there's always going to be pushback, and there's always going to be violence that goes along with that. And that doesn't mean that's, by the way, counter revolutionary violence as well. We've seen a lot of that.
Oh, very much so. Yeah.
I'm in Texas. They just they're having this trial right now where this ex military cop just was texting people, I want to go out and shoot a Black Lives Matter protester. And then he did 2 weeks later, and the jury found him guilty. And now the governor is trying to intervene and get him off. So it's like, yeah, I mean, like these entrenched systems of violence are very real. And I don't think that people have any illusion about them. So I'm not really sure what I'm trying to say, but
I'm following you though. I mean, it just speaks to the complication we were just talking about. I've become interested in all of these aspects to it, because you can't just really take like one aspect. You start investigating environmental disasters. You find yourself rethinking a lot of different things, but you're right. I mean, like you have to take in some of that hypocrisy and compartmentalize it. You have to.
Yeah, I think like I was going to respond earlier. It's like, there were so many hypocritical and disingenuous things about Occupy, but I was involved in Occupy. I was down at LA City Hall like for 2 weeks, and like that argument was very prevalent at the time. It's like, well, you're doing this on an iPhone, but it's like the counter response to that is like, why wouldn't you use every tool at your disposal?
Yeah.
And the other thing that I, realized while I was there, because I had spent so much time in India and Nepal prior to that, it's like I'm kind of looking at all these people that, even then were younger than me, sadly, who are involved in Occupy, and a lot of them are, it's like, what's their beef? It's like, well, their beef is that they're making $30,000 a year as a graphic designer, and they feel that that's unfair. And it's like, the point I was making to people that nobody wanted to hear is like, look, if you make over $30,000 a year in 2012 terms, you are in the global 1%. It's like, I've been in India watching people die of poverty. I've had a conversation with a guy in India once where he's just like, I make $1 a day brutally washing, in hot steam rooms, washing clothing. And every day I would just think about killing myself. So because that I would be worth more to the people I care about dead. So I don't think about have any conception of how bad a lot of people in the world have it.
Yeah, and there's a level of disingenuousness on the left about how bad things actually are versus how bad. Because like in order to have this sort of persona as an activist, a lot of times people have to make it sound worse than it is. And to make it sound there's been no progress in any of these areas over the last decades, and it's bullshit. There's been a lot of progress. Yeah, and opposed.
But that said, a lot of that progress has been made because of activism.
Yeah, like that's
the the 5-day work week, for instance, the 40-day work week. It's like pretty blatant things.
Yeah, and that's sort of like, it's not, and that could be interpreted as an argument for being complacent, and it's not. It's an argument for pushing forward. It's like, hey, we made some progress. We got to keep it moving. We can't get stuck. We can't become complacent because we've made progress. That's all. There's always this sort of like dumb argument that's like, because there's never been any progress. Things are still the same. I just think it's only
that's not true.
It's not true, and I think it's also.
Go ahead.
No, just part of it. Like I just said, part of what we're doing is moving it forward by not being complacent, but also recognizing that, like, the 60s didn't get it all wrong. They all didn't become like yuppies. It was all, it's oversimplification. It's generalization.
it's also oversimplification to like think that there's some monolithic bad guy side. It's like a lot, a lot of the people, it's just people wherever you look. And, it's like, even like that point about people in the 60s becoming yuppies. It's like, whenever you encounter somebody and you think that they are a solid thing, you're only seeing somebody at one point on the line of their entire life. And if you think about how many changes and you've gone through in your life, it's like people are long processes of change. And so you don't necessarily know who you're dealing with, or who they've been in the past, or why they've come to the conclusion of why they are where they are, or who they're going to become. So I think it's really not to essentialize people, but I think that there really is a kind of, to your earlier point about magic, I think there is a kind of a magic process to point at here, which is like, if you try to change one thing in society, pretty soon you kind of understand. I mean, immediately you come up against the wall of why that's not possible. And if you get, then people get frustrated and resort to violence. Well, that I think is a much less compelling option than you begin to try to understand the entire system, or maybe you begin around with the system of interlocking, the system of interlocking systems around the thing that you're looking at. And then maybe that expands out to like, well, how does the country work? How does the political process work? How does the business process work? How does the journalistic process work? How do human beings think? How does psychology work? And then ultimately you have to like kind of end up at this point where you start off trying to enact reform in a system, and then you end up trying to seek, quote unquote, union with God. You're trying to seek union with the entire system. You're trying to understand the entire system. And that's a spiritual growth process. And I think it's only from that position of understanding as much of it as you possibly can that you can affect change. And I think even a concrete way of saying that is like, you're not going to be able to talk to the people that are able to make the change without speaking their language. And you're not going to be able to speak their language without understanding their language and how they think. So, and just that process will unite you with them in a positive way, where it's like, well, now you understand where they're coming from. Now you understand this thing that you're interacting with. That's a very magical process.
Yeah, and I imagine that the magical process is just the act of like becoming like whoever you're going to be in your different, like you really just said it. I mean, a lot of it is who you are in that moment. You can't. It's very difficult to make those assumptions. One of the things that you were just, when you were talking about this sort of I was thinking before we got started, I was like reading some of the journalism around East Palestine, what we were talking about earlier, the disaster there, and I was reading a lot of the journalism around it, and the bit of business about how they were extras in we didn't talk about this yet, but the extras inside the Don DeLillo White Noise film. Did you hear about this?
Yeah, I remember I saw something about that tangentially, but talk about that.
As I understand it, that they shot in East Palestine or outside of East Palestine, they shot some of the White Noise film adaptation, which involved. I've read the novel in college, and I really don't remember it.
Yeah, me too.
But there was some bit of business with like a dark cloud, like it had something to do with maybe it was a chemical spill or something like that, and that these people were extras in the film, and then here's this thing that's so similar to it in real life.
I shouldn't laugh.
That's like,
yeah.
But isn't that fascinating, right? Isn't that speak to like sort of synchronous? I get why like it's a great journalistic plot point, and because when it was coming around, because it's fascinating, right? Like that that sort of synchronicity around events, and I think that there's some that kind of gets at some of this sort of complexity, the circles on circles of everything in all at once.
Yeah,
in these sort of discussions, these sort of these when we look at things like activism, or we look at like the power of positive thinking and all this stuff. There's all this other stuff at play you just can't see.
Yeah. And it's funny because that in a way is kind of like what a lot of postmodern literature was trying to point at. But
Yeah.
it also points at like you said earlier, like the kind of the cosmic joke behind things. It points that everything is interconnected. It points that everything is the fact that everything is repeating patterns. Yeah, I love that. I mean, I can think of tons of times that things like that have happened.
You get a glimpse. Sometimes you get a glimpse to the synchronicity of events, to the sort of, and I think there's magic in that, that synchronicity, that phenomena of not being able to make that something like that would just line up exactly in that place at that time, because that train could have derailed anywhere.
Yeah.
Like, unlike the sites that are in my book, these were like dumping pollution sites. These were mining sites. This is where, where oil leached into the ground. These are just like, these are from industry. All of these events are from industry, and that train could have derailed anywhere.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating.
It is fascinating. I mean, you can definitely go on some tangents from that, try to explain why that is. I mean, I think that, and these things point to like different levels of understanding, perhaps. I mean, it's like, the first thing is like, maybe you could go to like the sympathetic magic position where it's like, oh, well, somehow those actors enacting that drama there caused the actual thing to happen. Or you can say something like, well, artists are, they're going into these trance states. So artists are kind of tapping into the timeline and are able to see the future, even if they're not aware of it. Or you can kind of come to the position that I'm at, where it's just like, why did it happen? Because it's funny.
Right. That's kind of my first instinct. But I mean, all of those magical positions, the act of willing it is kind of, I don't know if I would buy that, because I think about all the movies that are made, and like every day I'm out there on the streets shooting TV shows every day. And this is
I'm not suggesting I believe that, by the way. I'm suggesting somebody could, from a certain level of understanding, could come at it and say something like that.
Sure. I could see that. Yeah. That'll never not be fascinating. Those little bits of glimpses into the I hate when people say the term glitch in the matrix. It almost like implies that, like, it kind of, it's, for some reason for me, makes me cringe a little bit. Like, it's like, I don't really buy that we're a simulation.
No, I don't either. And it also makes it inorganic, and it also says that something is glitched or something is wrong, rather than this is just kind of the way reality works, maybe.
Right. That this is right, actually. This is right on time. This train was supposed to derail here. It's like a pre-design, right? Like it presupposes pre-design. Like there's design elements, and I think it's a corny metaphor too.
Yeah. It's amazing that people are still using Matrix metaphors after what,
right.
5 years later. Well, yeah, there's something like there really is something about magic and neo-paganism that it comes out of as well, of at least the modern magic movement, of this idea of paganism or druidry or focus on nature. And my take on that is, or just the place that I got to in my life and my own process is, look, like all these sides, like red, blue, whatever, political standpoints, whatever, culture war, like this is all human nonsense. Like everything that humans do is inherently insane and nonsensical. Like human beings are incapable of perceiving reality directly. They're incapable of articulating reality correctly. They miscommunicate more than they communicate. Just look at any relationship and misunderstandings that happen within it. It's like it's a miracle that people haven't all murdered each other by now. So human beings are just inherently faulty, and everything that they do, as far as I'm concerned, is ridiculous. So the idea that one side or ideological position or cultural position or identity is like what everyone needs to get behind is just a non-starter for me. My political position has been since 2010, actually a little earlier, but I clearly articulated it in 2010, is the environment is what's important. And the reason is all that anyone is doing is everyone's playing games, like people are playing, everything that people do is a game. But if you have no game board, then everyone's shit out of luck. So I think that the position for magical activism in the 21st century, or just activism period, is environment first. I mean, make sure that everyone doesn't die of rare cancers first, and then we can sort everything else out afterwards.
Absolutely. I remember being a kid in the 80s and asking my dad, I was like, why is the environment a liberal position? And he's like, it's not. It's an everybody position.
Yeah.
And he was right, you know? And I still think about that to this day, that then we have to depoliticize the environment. That's like, should be one of our frontline priorities. Is like, first off, let's stop the fighting over this and just get on the same page that we don't want cancer. Which is insane that we have to have this discussion, but that seems to be the case. And when I was researching my book and I interviewed, you know, like I said, like one of the best guys was the governor, one of the, you know, the best advocates for this problem in Oklahoma was a Republican governor. You would never think that today, but why not? You know, I mean, why?
Yeah.
Why can't we?
Why not? Exactly.
So that's something I think about a lot, and I won't really engage. I do like the snark, but I really don't engage like that online. I don't like it. You know,
Arnold Schwarzenegger was very good on the environment when he was the Republican governor of California. I mean, I think, and I think that the reasoning as to why that would be is like, oh, well, the Republicans are subject to corporate capture. Well, so are the Democrats. You know, it's like they're both subject to capture the same corporations. So
yeah, and you also have to be careful not to both sides it, because, you know, one is pretty deeper in, and the other side at least has a contingent that is like, no, we're actually not going to take your money. So not exactly
Green New Deal and all of that.
You know, there's that. So you know, anyway.
I think your point though of the environment being an everybody issue. I mean, that's the thing to work towards. That's the critical thing. And I think that the language matters. Actually, again, Arnold Schwarzenegger had a really good point where he doesn't, I think this is a step in the right direction, where he doesn't talk about global warming. He talks about pollution, because that's a more tangible thing for people and takes it out of the realm of, well, is it real? Is it not? And also, and it also becomes, I mean, everyone understands pollution. You don't have to explain it. And also it becomes something pollution you can do something about. You know, global warming is like a big giant what the fuck. Pollution you can always clean up. So I think that was actually very clever on his part. But the other thing, you know, the most popular tweet I have ever had, or social media message I've ever had in my entire life, or at least on Twitter, was it had nothing to do with anything I ever talk about, of course. I just put out a tweet where there was a news article like 5-6 years ago that Alzheimer's had been linked to poor oral hygiene. And that it got like 18 gajillion retweets. And that first I was just like, of course it would be something that has nothing to do with anything I talk about or benefits me in any way. But then I was like, well, this is just such a touch. This says so much. It's like this issue touches so many people and is not political and is heartbreaking and is terrifying for everyone that it touches. You know, it's like I've had that in my own family. It's like that's something that everyone can get behind going away. I mean, who wants to see their parents forget who they are? You know? Yeah.
And again, you know, that's like what you were saying about rhetoric matter. You know, it matters, and it's something that everyone could do. I tend to take a dim view on this, and I don't think they will. I think people are too addicted to the rush of outrage and outraging each other. And I feel it myself. I'm like, sometimes I read something horrific online, and I want everyone else to see it.
Sure. Yeah. And I'll put some bars. Because I call it eating fire ants.
Right. And I mostly on Twitter, I just mostly engage with music Twitter. It's really like my hobby. It's like what I love. You know?
How is that?
Oh, I love it. I just like, you know, I've discovered so many jams like through like jazz Twitter, you know, like just so many things I never would have found otherwise.
Oh, that's awesome.
Where mostly in the last few years, it's my interest has been in jazz, you know, but you know, you come out of like, there's still, you know, I came out of punk and hip hop, you know, mostly. And so, you know, it's naturally, these labels are kind of annoying, but I find that like most of the people I follow on Twitter are just other heads, people are interested in like learning something about, just
That's
sharing.
so cool.
I love that.
I've noticed that. I've noticed that as well. I've noticed that as well because I'm a huge audiophile, which is another way of saying I'm now middle aged. But
Yeah.
yeah, and so I've noticed on like music YouTube, like I'm sure you've seen this, like people just upload all these rare obscure albums, and like the comments are always so lovely and polite, and it's just like, if you're listening to this, I hope all is well in your world, brother.
Yeah.
Like
That's
that.
where the love is. That's where the love
It's
is.
so amazing. It's like
It really is.
yeah, it's great. Just like finding these old like 80s Japanese like, you know, obscure records and things like that. And then the comments are always just like all love.
Yeah, I talk to other crate diggers too, who are like, "Oh my god, look at this thing I found for $3," and it'll be like some rare thing, It's like some private press, and you're like, "Holy shit!" It's just like just a fun aspect to the internet that I think we tend to talk about like the doom and gloom and how shitty this is and that is, but the real love is in the is on music Twitter and places like that. I once saw a tweet. A really funny tweet that was like, when you hit 35, you actually YouTube 2 opens up, which is just uploads of Japanese jazz records. And
yeah. That was like the only thing keeping me sane during 2020 was just like these like super like prosaic Japanese like ambient albums from the 80s of just kind of like elevator music. It's like I had to listen to that stuff to keep from losing it.
Oh yeah, like Hiromi Hosono's like Exotica stuff and yeah, I love all that stuff, man. And yeah, there's every day I try to listen to like 5 new records a day on average. Funny. New to me. That could be like just came out in the 60s, Mostly lately, just this week I've been really on a kick of like Japanese psychedelic rock that I never found.
Oh, nice.
Previously.
Julian Cope.
Yeah, the Jap rock sampler.
Yeah.
It's those are all huge guides for me. I refer to them.
I love Julian Cope. I love that. I'm huge on krautrock also. That's like my go-to.
Yeah, well, it's one of mine too.
I just gotta I finally achieved my decades long life goal of getting Sennheiser 800s. So I've just been jamming on those. So life is good with those.
Oh, it's so good. Yeah, I think like I'm 45, and I think the audiophile thing really kicked in for me about when I turned 40. Okay. I've always had stereos, but but I don't know. At some point, it became very important for me to be able to hear things really well. And I think we came up in the age of like cassettes going into CDs, going into shitty MP3s.
Yeah.
And I kind of lost like for a while. I couldn't really, I don't know if I was really hearing what I was supposed to be hearing until I really got interested in production. And, I'm out there just trying to make as much money as I can so I could just keep buying records.
Nice. Yeah, no, it's amazing how much, music that people get now really is like the fast food version of food. Like I'm super into cooking too. And I'm always like shocked, like when you actually make a full recipe, like how different it is from the mass produced version. Or like even, like I recently learned, and this will not be news to a lot of people, but I recently learned, like I got a copy of the whole seed catalog, and I realized like the vegetables and fruits we see at the supermarket are like 1% of the available things, just because they're the ones that are easily mass produced and shipped. But it's like there's so many weird psychedelic vegetables and fruits out there that no one's ever heard of, or I hadn't heard of.
Oh yeah,
it's just like
I've seen. What's the whole seed catalog? I think I was reading about this. Is this it? I'm not clear on what it is.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think it's just a couple bucks. You can, I'm sure, get it online. It's just literally a catalog of seeds that you can get for rare vegetables and plants and things to grow. So that are like kind of out
That's
of
great.
They're like obscure vegetables, So, but yeah, right. With music, it's like not just MP3s, but like how shitty production is now with all the compression and stuff is produced to play in supermarket speakers. So
Yeah, and little iPhone speakers and stuff. It's some of it, and then there's also seems to be a movement, in certain hip hop too, to make things bigger and expand it too. So there's like these two branches, right? And they're going in two radically different directions. There's like the real compressed. They used to call it ringtone rap. I don't know what they call it now. It was very tinny sounding, and then there's the other side that's real big, like big production. They can do with very little. I love, there's just so, and I do take advantage of living here and going to see things, when I can, going to the shows.
Yeah, that stuff I'm obsessed with all that stuff, and it is a refuge for me. And yeah, I guess it's you. It's like it just happens when you turn 40. I guess I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I don't know what it is either. I mean, I've always like my whole life, I've listened to a lot of music, a lot of different kinds of music, and always tried to challenge myself. And I've fallen in love so many times along the way, but as I got older, that never went away. I know like a lot of guys around our age, a lot of people around our age rather, it goes away. They like could just take or leave music.
Not me. I mean, I'm still imprinted on all the stuff I listened to in my early 20s and late teens because that's just the most imprinted in my brain. But I think that, like, I have Kobas. It's like I'm constantly just finding it. That's one of the really cool things about now is that you have access to like all music, and you can just go down. I was listening to like, Vietnamese bar music from people who were entertaining soldiers in the war, in the 60s. It's just like, this stuff is phenomenal. Or Cambodian psychedelic music. You can find everything. You can go down and for me, music and food are similar in that they're a type of travel. You're traveling around the world and experiencing life through other people's beings that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. That's a beautiful thing about music. I mean, you can feel what other people are feeling, and it's a way to learn about the world.
Yeah, and like you were saying, the things that you loved as a young person will always be a part of you. They'll always be there, and you'll always return to them. There's stuff I like that I know objectively I wouldn't like now if I discovered it now, but I love it because of being a young person when I discovered it. Like I was thinking the other day, I was like, if I was like a kid metalhead in the 80s. I was like a grade school metalhead, like if I heard Megadeth today, I'd probably think it was so stupid, but I love it because I was in second grade, when Pete Cells came around, and I think it's beautiful. But like if I heard it today, like my tastes changed because like we were talking about earlier with like all the other stuff we were just talking about, like you change, you become different, and you evolve and you grow. You still retain some of who you were, but not all of it. It's complicated and beautiful.
For sure. And music is, at least for me, just so much a part of who I am. And the cool thing about audiophile stuff too is you can go back to all that stuff you listen to and hear it in a totally new way and hear things you never heard before. When you were listening to Megadeth on a cassette, it's like, I'm sure it was different system.
And
now.
some stuff,
new stuff.
Yeah, like my living room is mostly geared towards like audiophile stuff, but it's something that was recorded like very like shitty still sounds great. Even on really good speakers, like something that was really poorly made. You think of like Husker Du did Zen Arcade in one night. That's like a double record. They did it in one night when the studio time was like cheap and they could get in there and they one take. That's beautiful to me. That's like they didn't need all that other stuff. They didn't need like the full studio Brian Eno of using the studio. So they just got it, And
so are you more of like do you do more of like speakers or headphones?
Both. I work a lot. I'm away a lot. So I have my my Jabra Elite speakers, my Jabra Elite headphones, which are perfectly fine for my, there's a certain amount of audio. There's an audiophile thing where I can't, it loses me at some point because there's things I can't hear. Because there's things I think other people are hearing, or at least they say they're hearing. I can't hear.
Right. But, there's a bit of self-delusion that goes into it. Although that said, I mean, I feel like there's like a steep curve going upwards of things sounding really, really, really better with everything that you add. And then it's just like the law of diminishing returns for a long, long, long time. And then like, if you get the top end stuff, it's like, holy shit, this is way better again. So I found, at least.
Yeah, at home I have a Rotel, a 90s Rotel and preamp in my living room. And we have a little farmhouse upstate, and I have an old Japanese Sansui up there, which doesn't sound as good, but it's like, this it's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's like it's my hobby.
That's great. Yeah, for me, music, particularly at that level, is like virtual reality, and it is like going to another universe, and without drugs or with drugs. So
yeah, I don't smoke pot anymore, but I think that like it's really with me still. Like the perception shifts. I think that like I'm altered, from psychedelics and everything. I don't really need them anymore. I mean, it would probably be good to shake the snow globe up, but it kind of scares me actually. When you get older and you have the world's weight.
Oh yeah, no, totally.
It's hard.
Yeah, like when I was doing, I was on for a certain era of my 20s. I think I was high every single day of my life for a long time, and now I'm not, and I haven't been for a long time. But yeah, it's like now if I do psychedelics, it's just like, oh, aging. It's like
right.
It's like
yeah, and you're like
failures.
Yeah, you're like there's that, and then there's also like the sort of you're more aware of the suffering in the world in a way.
Yeah,
like in your 20s, it's so easier to do because you have like less to care about, and then as you get a little more world weary, that weighs on me. I mean, I get much more sensitive to stuff, and having kids too, that changes your brain. So your threshold for the world suffering, I think, is a little lower.
How did you find it changed your brain?
And you're cutting out. What'd you say?
Oh, I said having kids changes your brain. How did you find that it did that?
Well, I think you become a little more afraid for them. You become a little more sensitive to the world. I mean, that's how it worked for me. And I've spoken to other people who've had children who have experienced this too, where you become more sensitive to I guess that's just the simplest way of putting it, is like the suffering seems outsized. It seems bigger in the world, because you feel very protective of them, and it's biological. I think it's millions of years of evolutionary hardwiring to be this way, to be protective.
Interesting. Well.
But I read it changes your brain chemistry. I know nothing about brain chemistry, so I couldn't comment on that.
Interesting.
Your poor listeners came here for environmental disasters. I know.
Well, they stayed for music Twitter. They came for a podcast. This was a great conversation. I think we're past the 2-hour mark. So, yeah, this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Where can people find? So, tell people where they can find out more about your books and also what you've got coming up that you're working on. You mentioned.
Well, I don't really. The only real online presence I have is Twitter, which is ML Nirenberg, MLNIRENBERG, and my book Earth AD is available anywhere books are available, on the internet at least, and I think Feral House likes us to. They used to. I don't know about now, but they like us to plug Bookshop over Amazon, which I think sounds good. And my documentary about Hustler magazine. My dad, the art director there, that was on Epix. I don't know where it plays now, but I think it's all over. Where I think it could be rented. I do get these little royalty checks sometimes, so I know it plays somewhere. Okay. That's about it. I try to keep my online footprint small.
Earth AD is on Amazon. All right. Hope you really, really enjoyed that. I definitely had a lot of fun in that conversation. Meet us at magic.me, magick.me, my school for magic, meditation, and mysticism, where you can learn all the skills you need to unleash your true self. I will see you in class, and until next time, hang in there.